Well, thanks for everybody sticking around here. This presentation is one part of my dissertation where I'm going to be looking to develop a tool to quantify hatchery contributions of channel catfish in Ohio reservoirs. Before I get into the talk, I want to thank a lot of people, specifically my support for the project, the Sport Fish Restoration Act. A lot of people at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, their Division of Wildlife, and then people in my lab at the Aquatic Ecology Lab, and then one big one for teaching me the technique, Anthony Ludsin at the Trace Elements Research Lab. So just kind of an outline of the talk. I'm going to be talking about managing stock fisheries, get into otoliths as a potential natural tag, talk about the Ohio stocking program a little bit, then get into some analyses and results, and then finally finish with some conclusions and management implications for this work. So first and foremost, some critical questions for managers of stocking programs. They need to know where to stock fish, so what reservoirs, how many fish to stock in these reservoirs, and then finally what size fish to stock. That last question is another part of my dissertation, looking at fingerlings versus yearlings in stocking. However, with this talk, I'm going to focus on those first two bullets there, and getting at that main question to understand both of those is, what are the contribution of our stocked individuals in these reservoirs? So understanding that contribution, some more questions that we need to know. A, are stocked individuals recruiting to the fishery? This is just an assumption that when we put fish in there, they're gonna stay in the fishery. Two, what are those relative contributions of those stocked individuals versus wild individuals in the fishery? And then three, do those contributions vary across reservoirs? Excuse me. So that's another chapter in my dissertation, is understanding that variation across reservoirs. But ultimately, to answer all these questions, managers need to know about post-stocking monitoring and assessment. Typically for post-stocking assessment, we use artificial tags such as fin clips, chemical markings, external tags. Unfortunately, the feasibility and longevity hinder some of these use. And then you can also cannot assess individuals already stocked. So we've been stocking Ohio since 1960, so we want to understand the contribution that's already in these reservoirs. So with these monitoring programs, you need to distinguish between stocked and wild individuals, obviously. However, most agencies lack this post-stocking monitoring program to assess these stocking programs. So we want to come up with a way to figure out how to backtrack and understand hatchery contributions when we haven't used these post-stocking monitoring systems. So here I'm going to be looking at that second question, what are the relative contributions of stocked versus wild individuals to the fishery? And I'm going to use otolith microchemistry as a natural tag of these fish. So just a quick intro of otoliths. If you don't know, they're these inner ear stones made mostly of calcium carbonate. They're used for balancing and hearing in fish. Otoliths produce these annual rings, as we've been talking about with aging, but we can also use them to understand location of fish throughout its life through this process called microchemistry. To do this, we use trace elements or trace metals that are incorporated into the otoliths, and in these otoliths they are incorporated at the proportion to the abundance in the surrounding water, so we can get the exact chemical makeup, the right chemical signature of the surrounding water in these otoliths. So the main elements that we typically focus on are strontium, barium, and magnesium here, but also other potential metals as well. So quickly, my method, I sectioned a lapillary otolith through the core. Then we use the laser ablation transect through the otolith. So we start at the core here, and then we move out with these spots throughout its entire life, making sure that we're in the core, we're in H1, and then we're at the edge of the otolith as well. So the ablations that I use 50 by 50 micron spots with typically 50 micron spacing between spots. And then the elements I sampled, just a slew of them here. Going to focus mostly on strontium and barium in this talk. So stocking in Ohio. Stocking began in 1960 to enhance the sport fishing opportunities for Ohio anglers. We've stocked in 112 reservoirs, lakes, and ponds since 2010. Most of these are stocked every other year. However, smaller ponds will typically get stocked every 3 to 4 years. These are reared in 3 different hatcheries. All individuals are spawned at the Senecaville State Fish Hatchery, and they either remain there or get transferred to either the Hebron State Fish Hatchery or the St. Mary's Fish Hatchery until stocked as yearlings. So kind of looking at the difference between these two, if you have two otoliths, one that's a wild versus one that's a stocked individual. So if you have that wild channel catfish otolith, you have a similarity of the signature throughout the whole otolith. So just one main signature in that otolith. However, if you have a stock channel catfish, you might have one signature in the core here of that Senecaville signature. You might get a second signature, whether it gets moved to either Hebron or St. Mary's, or that stays blue and is still the Senecaville signature there. And then finally, once it gets stocked in the reservoir, you get that reservoir signature. So that's how we can predict differences between stocked and wild individuals in these otoliths. And just for record's sake, we stock about 150,000 channel catfish across all of our reservoirs, lakes, and ponds in Ohio. For the most part, they're all yearlings, and then we do have some occasional fingerling dumps if we have excess fingerlings. So we analyze fish from 8 different stocked reservoirs with varying sample sizes there. And then we also used 2 non-stocked reservoirs as negative controls to see if we were getting the hatchery signature in those cores from non-stocked reservoirs to either A, understand movement, or B, understand if the method isn't working like it should. So to classify stocked versus wild individuals, I used a quadratic discriminate function analysis. So this estimates the probability of the response variable using Bayes' theorem. These are classification models, and these classification models are built on known signatures. So your wild known signature is the edges from the wild-caught individuals in each reservoir. So we use HoopNet sampling that's been talked about by Steve Tyszko, and we use those individuals, and we use the edges, the signature of those edges as the reservoir signature because they were caught in the reservoir, so they were there. Then we used yearlings and our broodstock edges for the Senecaville State Fish Hatchery, known signature. And then we used yearling edges that came from Hebron and St. Mary's for those signatures for Hebron and St. Mary's. We used the QDFA classification models for each reservoir, so using those known signatures to predict the origin of the unknown wild-caught individuals. So that's the reservoir otolith core that is unknown, whether it's from the reservoir or from a hatchery. With this, you get a posterior probability of assignment for those individuals that just assesses our assignment confidence. So we used a jackknife, basically leave one out, resampling method to quantify classification model accuracy. So we wanted to know how accurate these models were. They varied from system to system based on either similarity of elemental signatures between the reservoir and the hatchery, or just the variation within reservoirs and hatcheries. We use strontium and barium as our predictors. This was through an AIC model selection. These are the best predictors of our known signatures. So running through one of these figures, so this is a model of known origin fish. So this is our classification model here that gives these output. So if we can walk through this a little bit, so these R's are our reservoir, the Rush Run reservoir here. Then we have the Senecaville State Fish Hatchery, yearling cores, and broodstock edges. So that's this down here is that Senecaville signature. Then we have the Hebron signature from the yearling edges up here. And then we have the St. Mary's signature over here. So this specific reservoir, going back to 2000, has been stocked from all 3 different reservoirs. So we needed all 3 reservoirs included in this model. You see this one red dot, one red R here. That means that it was misclassified in our training model, and that's what gives us our model accuracy. So anytime you see a red individual, that gives us that was misidentified as something else. So in this case, that is a known rush run core or edge, but it was classified incorrectly as a Hebron individual. So that gives us our model accuracies for these. We use this model to predict the origins of those reservoir caught individuals. So we used the model that built this plot here to analyze those otolith cores that were caught from the reservoir. So then each fish is given a posterior probability of assignment, like I said earlier. This provides a level of confidence in our predicted origin. These range from 0 to 1 for each choice. So each Hebron, St. Mary's, Senecaville, and Rush Run gets a level of confidence. That range from 0 to 1, and then they all sum up to 1. So hypothetically, you could have 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, and then 0.6 for Senecaville, and that would be 60% confident that it came from Senecaville. Or if you're extremely confident in one, maybe Hebron has a 99, or so it's 0.99, and then these all equal 0.1. So then you could feel pretty confident, 99% confident that that individual came from Hebron State Fish Hatchery. So in this case, we had 69 individuals, and our model accuracy was 99.5%, which is extremely high. This shows that we only had one misidentified individual. So really good accuracy in the model here. And then if we create a table here, so we have different levels of our posterior probability of assignment thresholds. So 0.5, so this is basically what it assigns at the lowest level, and then we have more confident intervals at 0.75, 0.9, and 0.95 for either the wild, so whether it came from Rush Run, or I added all three hatcheries together to get the hatchery origin probability of assignment. And then finally we have the percent contribution of hatchery individuals. So that last column is the unknown cores, how many of those were marked out as hatchery origin. So in this case, at the 0.50 level, we have 48 from the wild, 21 from the hatchery to give us about 30% hatchery contribution. Then we have 31% contribution. So as we go down, you can also see that these numbers decrease. So some of those that are so the model is not as sure on about on 4 wild individuals and 1 hatchery individual, but we still get the similar percent contribution as we increase to here. So again, we lose 2 individuals when we go to 90% confidence in our assignment, still at 30% contribution, and then again 31% contribution when we lose 2 wild individuals here. So with 95% confidence, we can say our percent contribution from the hatchery is 31% at Rush Run. So looking at a little bit messier model, or classification model. So this model, you can see a lot more red letters. So this model has a lower accuracy at 75.8% model accuracy, which is still high. It's higher than a lot of what has been published in the literature, but it's just not as good as that previous model I showed. So here, if we just put up that table again, our percent hatchery contribution at Baroque at the 0.5% confidence is 36%, and then that drops to 31% at 95% confidence. In our 2 non-stocked reservoirs, these are just the classification models that I had. They both had high model accuracies at 95 and 96%, but when I assigned those to the unknown reservoir cores, we had 0 hatchery contribution in both of our non-stocked reservoirs. So that indicates that we are doing a good job of being able to predict those hatchery individuals in these reservoirs, because when we don't have stocked individuals, we get 0% contribution. So then just giving a summary table of the 8 reservoirs that we looked at, plus the 2 non-stocked. So that, I apologize for this being big and messy, but if we look at our classification model accuracies, they were all above that 75%, or around that 75%, ranging from 100% in Hargis year having another at 94, 98%. So some really high model accuracies in my quadratic discriminant function models. And then if we look at our percent hatchery contribution, those range from anywhere from 80 or 86% all the way down to less than 1% in hatchery contribution. So extremely variable throughout our reservoirs. So then just getting into the conclusions, otolith microchemistry was able to differentiate between hatchery reared and wild produced channel catfish individuals. No individuals from the non-stocked reservoirs were classified as hatchery individuals, so that's a good control for us there. Our model assignment accuracies were all high across our reservoirs, anywhere from 75% to 100%, so really confident in those models. However, we did see some of those misidentified individuals in some of the training models, so I want to go back and look at those misidentified individuals to understand whether they were from one cohort, if they're older fish, if they're younger fish, to see if there's a pattern in those misidentified individuals, to see if, why we're getting some of those lower model accuracies. And then two, hatchery contributions varied among our stocked reservoirs. Our mean contribution was about 29% across. However, it was extremely variable, anywhere from 1% to 86% hatchery contribution in the reservoirs. And the next step with this, I want to use these individuals with an extremely high posterior probability of assignment to examine cohort and performance differences between hatchery reared and wild individuals. To understand, once I know the fish is either from the hatchery or from the wild, then we can assess differences in growth, max age, mean length at age across those individuals in our reservoirs to see if there's difference in performance between hatchery reared and wild fish in our reservoirs. And then so finally, some management implications. We do recommend exploring the use of this tool for post-stocking assessments in other channel catfish populations and potentially other catfish populations. We may need to use other natural tags for some of those reservoirs. It might just be that these reservoirs are too similar to our hatchery signatures, so we could look into some genetics to understand differences, or get into the isotopic signatures. So looking at different isotopes of strontium potentially to give a more fine view of those signatures. And they've done a lot of that isotopic signatures in in Alaska for salmon populations. So then finally, understanding hatchery contributions is simply just one piece of the puzzle for managers of stock populations. It is not the end-all be-all in saying that this is the amount of individuals from the hatchery. You do need to understand population demographics to avoid overstocking. So if you do have high contribution, but you also have a ton of individuals, maybe you still want to stock less, even though that most of them are coming from the hatchery. You also want to understand angler preferences. Is this going to be a trophy or a subsistence fishery? So your management decisions will change based on what type of fishery you want. And then also, potentially there could be harvest rate differences. Some of the literature says in other species, hatchery individuals are more adept or are more willing to bite on lures from anglers. So there could be some harvest rate differences to get at some of those lower percent contributions where they're actually in the fishery. However, they're just getting fished out at a higher rate potentially. So understanding all these different aspects will give you a more clear picture of your decision-making process for these fisheries. And with that, I thank you for listening to the last talk, and I'll take any questions if you have any. Yeah.
Did the percent contribution correlate at all with the reservoir size? Did you look at that?
Yeah, so some of our larger reservoirs do have smaller percent contribution. It wasn't a perfect correlation though. So some of them we still need this stock. And those were typically the lower productive, the less productive reservoirs. But that's one of the next steps for me to see why these vary among reservoirs. This was just kind of given the method, and that's the next step that I want to look at more. Yes?
So do you suspect that there's considerable year-to-year variation in the reservoir and hatchery signatures that would require you to do this sort of on a cohort basis?
Potentially, yeah. There might be some interannual variation. There's not interannual variation in the hatcheries. So I got about 10 brood stock, and so I went across their whole lifespan, and there seems to be extreme low interannual variability, but there definitely could be in our reservoirs. So that's why I want to go back to some of those inner cores that I took to be able to see from a fish that was in these reservoirs for 10 years that I could trace the previous years back and see the variability there. Absolutely. And that might also get at some of my the lower model accuracies as well to see, okay, these are extremely variable habitats.
That was my same question, how stable the water chemistry values are.
In the reservoirs, I'm not certain, but in the hatcheries, they're extremely stable. Yes.
Did you see any evidence of vaterite in your otoliths?
Luckily, no. Yeah. So I think those are more prone in sagittal otoliths than these lapilar otoliths. So yeah, I was lucky with that because we really haven't there hasn't been any microchemistry studies on catfish, and so I was worried about that as well. But no, I did not find any vaterite. Yes.
Are you aware of any like hatchery feeds that are available that you can kind of like begin to impregnate some of these fish with a, some sort of compound or some sort of isotope that it's more traceable and lends you to have the ability to have better accuracy?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's one thing at the start of this project we wanted to do. We were thinking about doing was the OTC marking of the otolith, and it just basically gives you a big red light in the otolith when you cut it open and look at it. However, that doesn't allow us to go to previous years. So that's why if I was doing the OTC marking or a feed to spike up the strontium or whatever, I would have to wait for future years for them to get into the fishery. And so with this being a PhD, I wanted to be able to look at previous years and be able to go now, catch the fish, look at the contributions now. And that's why we kind of just chose the elemental signatures and trying to see if the difference is there. But yeah, you definitely could, if you wanted this to be a much more long-term project, is to start OTC marking, or there are definitely feeds that spike strontium in the cores. Absolutely. Yep.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is there exploitation data, angler exploitation data for some of those reservoirs, and have you looked at how that might relate to your percent contributions?
No, so we really don't have any angler exploitation data. We have some creel survey data, but nothing that's really useful at this moment. Yeah, that's kind of the next step that we would love to.
One of your last points was that you think that those stock fisheries you're catching might be pulled out of there, which is a fine thing, but if you actually compare it.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Be able to that would be nice to have to potentially go out in the future and have creel surveys of either tagged fish or just kind of understanding the rate of fishing mortality for hatchery versus wild individuals. Yeah, that'd be extremely interesting. Yeah, I wish I had time to do that, but
yeah, are they being caught or are they just contributing?
Yep, absolutely.
Great. Oh,
yeah.
What's the cost to run one of those samples?
So one sample from the beginning to the end is about $37. Oh, so unfortunately, I would have to clarify. So that's me running the analyses. So if you send it off to someone else, it would be extremely higher. So luckily, we have the Trace Elements Research Lab at Ohio State that I was able to shoot the lasers myself, and so that it dropped the cost significantly. But yeah, from start to finish, the whole process is $37 per sample.
Okay.
Thank you.